it comes to tonight's episode and Saint Athanasius' work, we have chosen to start with his famous work, which he titled Against the Heathen. Again, this is the work of Saint Athanasius, who lived in the 4th century. He was known in the church history as a martyr, as an apologist, as a saint. He wrote extensively, and his material is a blessing to the global church. And I shall start for tonight with when it comes to his first book, which he titled Against the Heathen. So, chapter 9, verse 1. For now the understanding of mankind leaped asunder from God, and going lower in their ideas and imaginations, they gave the honor due to God, first to the heaven and the sun and moon, to the star and the stars, thinking them to be not only gods, but also the causes of the other gods lower than themselves. Paul, this reminds me of how the ancients saw the celestial bodies as angels and gods, right?
Yeah, that's pretty common. And even in Bible scripture, you get lots of passages where stars and some sort of spiritual beings overlap. Star language represents spiritual beings quite often. So you get that. And it's one thing to have the stars and angels as servants, but it's another thing to worship them.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent comment. Then, going yet lower in their dark imaginations, they gave the name of gods to the upper ether and the air and the things in the air. Next, advancing further in evil, they came to celebrate as gods the elements and the principles of which bodies are composed, heat and cold and dryness and wetness. This reminds me of Paul when he was writing Ephesians and Philippians and all these elements and stuff. So Athanasius is on the spot right here. Verse 3, for to such a depth have some fallen in their understanding, to such darkness of mind, that they have even devised for themselves and made gods of things that had no existence at all, nor any place among things created, for mixing up the rational with the irrational, and combining things unlike in nature. They worship the result as gods, such as the dog-headed and snake-headed and ass-headed, so donkey-headed gods among the Egyptians, and the ram-headed Ammon among the Libyans. While others, dividing apart the portions of men's bodies, head, shoulder, hand, and foot, have set up each as gods and deified them, as though their religion were not satisfied with the whole body in its integrity. Verse 4, but others, straining impiety to the utmost, have deified the motive of the invention of those things and of their own wickedness, namely pleasure and lust, and worship them, such as their Eros and the Aphrodite at Paphos. While some of them, as if vying with them in depravation, have ventured to erect into gods their rulers or even their sons, either out of honor for their princes or from fear of their tyranny. This reminds me in the 1st century when well, not just in 1st century, but 1st century, especially when Romans had to idolize and worship Caesar, and Christians in the 1st century, maybe even onwards until Christianity became the official religion, Christians were actually seen as atheists because they only recognized Jesus as God. They didn't recognize these other deities. And for Romans, like it was exclusive. Like, yeah, we have like a plethora of gods, gazillion gods. You can have Jesus, but you also have to bow to Caesar. So this reminds me of them. So from fear of their tyranny. And then he says, such as the Cretan Zeus, of such renown among them, and the Arcadian Hermes, and among the Indians, Dionysus, among the Egyptians, Isis and Osiris and Horus, and in our own time, Antinos, favorite of Hadrian, emperor of Romans, whom although men know he was a mere man and not a respectable man, but on the contrary, full of licentiousness, yet they worshipped for fear of him that enjoyed it. Okay, chapter 10, verse 1. But this custom is not a new one, nor did it begin from the Roman Senate. On the contrary, it had existed previously from of old, and was formerly practiced for the devising of idols, for the gods renowned from an old among the Greeks, such as Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo. I don't know how to read this. I
Have
don't know.
faced this. Yeah.
Hephaestus, thanks, Hermes, and among females, Hera and Demeter and Athena and Artemis, were decreed the title of gods by the order of Theseus, or Theseus, of whom Greek history tells us. And so the men who pass such decrees die like men and are mourned for, while those in whose favor they are passed are worshipped as gods. Okay, so we see here the idolization and divinization of man. And this is different of what we in Christianity may call as theosis. While theosis is godly way of us sanctifying and becoming more like Christ, we can see that this is a pagan way of just idolizing creation. Would you agree?
Yeah, it is, and it's interesting that most of these, gods characters do represent human qualities or natural qualities, but they take on these mythic, personal identities that can then also be idolized, and so it's one of my favorite sayings when it comes to this stuff is the smoke and mirrors is there's a kernel of truth probably to all of this, but then it gets stretched and twisted for other means and purposes, which isn't right.
Excellent, thank you. What a height of inconsistency and madness. Man, Athanasius was upset. Knowing who passed the decree, they pay greater honor to those who are the subjects of it. Verse 4. For example, in Egypt, even to this day, the death dirge is celebrated for Osiris or and Horus and Typho and the others, and the cauldrons of Dodona and the Corybantes in Crete prove that Zeus is no god but a man, and a man born of a cannibal father. And strange to say, even Plato, the sage admired among the Greeks with all his vaunted understanding about God, goes down with Socrates to Piraeus to worship Artemis, a figment of man's art. Honestly, I did until I read this, I didn't know that about Plato, and I was a little bit disappointed because I remember in my philosophy class when we were mentioning Plato, my professor, he was hopeful and even leaning on that side that hey, maybe the classical Greek philosophers, they had some revelation of the one and true God, and they don't have revelation as the Christians had, right? Because they lived before Christ, but they had some revelation in their wisdom. They wrote about him, right? The uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. So my professor was hoping that Plato had epiphany of the one true God and that he sought him and in a way worshiped him. Yet we see here from Athanasius that even Plato went and to worship Artemis. So for me, I found that disappointing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Plato, I mean, I think of even the start of Romans, where the knowledge of God in nature has been present to everybody. And Plato seemed to want to see beyond what was going on in the common culture and worship, and how idolatry was shaping how people acted or made choices. But even his forms seemed to be the Greek gods just stripped of the human part of them, right? So you've got the authority of Zeus and the wisdom of Athena and pure light of Apollo, but without meddling in wars and sexual immorality and that sort of thing. So he's on the path, but he still practiced like an Athenian and doing all that other stuff.
By the way, and I don't want to digress. This is the last comment when it comes to this section. It just reminds me, without condemning anyone, it reminds me of those believers who have not um, set in their heart 100% to follow God in His way, but are still, because they are not sure, they're not deeply rooted in God, they're still doing some ways of false tradition, not Christian tradition, but human tradition and customs, so they can appease their maybe ancestors or superstition, or maybe their family members or other people. So let me just do this so I can have peace of mind, or because of others. So this kind of reminds me like he was still behaving in the way his culture was. So I don't know. Chapter 16, verse 2. For if what is said in the poets is fictitious and false, even the nomenclature of Zeus, Kronos, Hera, Ares, and the rest must be false. For perhaps, as they say, even the names are fictitious, and while no such being exists as Zeus, Kronos, or Ares, the poets feign their existence to deceive their hearers. But if the poets feign the existence of unreal beings, how is it that they worship them as though they existed? Uh, Paul, I'll probably ask you a little bit later again, but like for Athanasius, these beings, these gods, did not exist. They're either idols or demons, or like we'll be reading later, or in some cases even both. But they did not exist as some um, principal or territorial beings, as Dr. Michael Heiser and many modern scholars do, and also which was the part of Jewish tradition, that there are these territorial fallen Elohim gods which were in control of certain regions, and they're way more powerful than just regular demons. But for Saint Athanasius, it was pretty much black and white. Like, oh, you're either the devil or the demon. And with demon, there's almost like he seemed to put different beings, different fallen entities, all in this category of demons. Is there any way we can somehow reconcile this view with the how the we have from from Jewish tradition and modern Christian scholars, how we have all these categories of the fallen beings?
I have an answer, but it's a little different slant from what you're thinking, I think. So um, I would give people credit that in the poets, the stories, the myths that we have, and I'm thinking too of what archaeology in the last while has uncovered in worship centers and temples. I'm thinking of Gobekli Tepe, in particular, right? Is that people seem to center around places where they had real spiritual experiences. So I can't completely dismiss that. Now, are they mistaken about what it was? And if it was a real spiritual encounter with where something supernatural was interacting with them and providing information, how accurate and is that spiritual thing lying? I'm not sure we can know. So I'm hesitant to say that it's completely false and they're nothing and it's all made up. I think there's enough evidence to say that that's probably not true. At least that's where I am right now. But I also think that they are not who they say they are. And going back to some of our previous discussions, I'm thinking about Marduk, who took on the mantle of other gods and probably assumed things. The stories of the Apkallu, who seemed to be these spiritual advisors, but weren't really who they said they were. And we do get stuff, as Michael Heiser would talk about. I'm thinking like, the Tower of Babylon and spirits that were sent over the nations and things, but then fell in turn. And so they didn't represent what they were actually supposed to do or who they were supposed to be. So I'd put it in the middle. I would disagree with Athanasius that, they're not nothing or just very low spirits, but they're obviously not, gods on par with Yahweh. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't want anyone to think we sound arrogant if we disagree ever with some theologian, pastor, historian, apologist, philosopher, or in this case, a saint of the church and a very famous one and a very amazing person we should look up to, right? But we're just dissecting his work and understanding how he would see these entities. So for him, it was either a demon or this entity didn't exist, but then we are leaning toward the other side, saying, well, if this is a demon, maybe it's not a demon per se. Maybe there's a demonic entity that is in different category than just a demon. And that's what we mentioned many times on the channel when we said that we have all these fallen Elohim, principalities, powers, dominion, who are in a bigger rank than just being a mere demon. So I see this as two different worldviews, but they don't necessarily have to contradict each other. Maybe the point is only how we see terminology when it comes to certain you know passages.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, one quick comment too. I think
Mhm.
it's important to put Athanasius in context too, right? He is, the church is growing quite a bit. There are still a number of pagan people in the area, although that is dwindling. But he's also fighting schisms and heresy in the church. You know, he was
Oh yeah, he
beating
was a
on every
famous
side.
apologist. Yeah, he
Yeah,
was.
yeah,
His work was always like exposing heresies and writing against them. So in that regard, I understand your point that he was saying, yeah, that's not a
yeah.
god. Like this is not a god. Let's not. If we make this and just idolize it, it's nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, across his writing, he may come across as pretty aggressive and on a single stance, but he kind of had to be. So I would give him that ground. I think with more information now, we have a lot more than he did. And I think we're going to talk about some of his experiences and someone else's that he talks about later too, that it might be different. But he kind of has to lay it out very, very straight just because of where he was at when he was dealing with.
Yeah, I'll just invite everyone to stay a little bit longer because when we come to the section where he describes a certain entity being, you'll clearly see that wasn't just a regular demon. So, in his apologetic spirit, I agree. Like, there's no other gods. Like, it's garbage. But in other side, he was like, hey, I actually had experience with this thing, and it's not a demon. But we're getting there. Okay, verse 3. Or perhaps once again, they will say that while the names are not fictitious, they ascribe to them fictitious actions. But even this is equally precarious as a defense. For if they made up the actions, doubtless they also made up the names to which they attributed the actions. Or if they tell the truth about the names, it follows that they tell the truth about the actions too. In particular, they who have said in their tales about these gods certainly know how gods ought to act and would never ascribe to gods the ideas of man. Yeah, because they seem to invent a lot of deities according to the man's likeness. So in the Bible, God made us in his image, but in many mythologies and religious, these gods are made in man's image because they're so imperfect and they resemble man in all their vice and sins. So yeah, I agree. Um, and, um, and would never ascribe to gods the ideas of man, any more than one would ascribe to water the properties of fire. For fire burns, whereas the nature of water, on the contrary, is cold. If then the actions are worthy of gods, they that do them must be gods. But if they are actions of men and of disreputable men, such as adultery and the acts mentioned above, they that act in such ways must be men and not gods. Yeah, because gods should be held to a way higher, uh, moral and spiritual level, right? People sin, but God should be held to much higher standards. For their deeds must correspond to their natures, so that at once the actor may be made known by his act, and the action may be ascertainable from his nature. So that just as a man discussing about water and fire and declaring their action would not say that water burned and fire cooled, nor if a man were discoursing about the sun and the earth, would he say the earth gave light while the sun was sown with herbs and fruits? But if he were to say so, he would exceed the utmost height of madness. Man, I love his zeal. So neither would their writers, and especially the most eminent poet of all, if they really knew that Zeus and the others were gods, invest them with such actions as show them to be not gods, but rather men, and not sober men. Man, he was the man, so to speak. He was so zealous. He was on fire, and I love his zeal. It just he didn't hold back. Like today, if you would say half of these things, you'll be canceled. Like you'll be condemned by the society. Back then, he was like, I don't care, because even he didn't even if I remember correctly, reading about him, he didn't even consider himself worthy to be called the disciple yet. He said, "No, the apostles are disciples. I'm yet to be proven to be a disciple if I die as a martyr." I'm like, dude, this guy was like on another level. He lived an ascetic. He spent so much time in the desert. He wanted to. I think he was the first monastic, or the Saint Anthony, about whom Saint Athanasius wrote, was the first monastic. It's either or, but anyway, he was on another level. So the way he spoke with such audacity is not much known to us, especially in the West, where we have to be so much politically correct. So I love this about Athanasius.